Okay, well, I guess we'll get going. Thanks again for joining us this afternoon. My name's Risa Shimon. I'm Executive Director of the River Management Society, and we're here to talk about what has become a familiar story in the news, and specifically a familiar story about some of the rivers that we depend on that are part of our communities. So we have a pretty cool assembly of folks to speak, and two of them aren't here because for one reason or another. So we're going to speak to what they were hoping to share, and then we have two awesome people who are here. And because we were slightly dyslexic when we put the pictures on this cover slide, we're not going in the order that you see them. So just bear with us a little bit. I'll share. Um, we're gonna first. I'm gonna first speak for Dave Payne, who's retired Forest Service Ranger in Happy Camp, California. Next, we'll speak to, and she might join us. She's at a trade show right now. I know she's in a busy place. Julie Jones, who's a general manager of Rocky Mountain Rafts in West Virginia. And then we'll hear from Hartwell Carson, who is here from the French Broad Riverkeeper, Mountain True, and then Dr. John Field will finish us up. And Angie, you want to introduce yourself while you go to the next slide?
Yeah, hi everyone. Angie Brayley here, River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society, and happy you're all joining us for our River Management Roundtable, our last one of 2024. These are monthly discussions that we hold, typically on the second Tuesday of the month, and we open it up to everyone, RMS members, non-members, and try to have discussions and share ideas, problem solve, network with others, really just facilitate an open forum to help support everyone as they're working on and with rivers. So a couple just program notes for today. We are recording and we'll put this onto our YouTube channel where you can check out all of our river management roundtables. Um, we will have time for questions and discussion. You're welcome to use the chat there, or you can come off mute. We don't have a huge group today, but we'll ask you to stay muted while our presenters are speaking. And yeah, just be respectful and listen to each other and all that kind of good stuff. So now I'm gonna pass it over to how about Dr. John Field to introduce himself real quick, and then Hartwell to introduce himself, and then uh, we can go from there.
Hello, John Field, fluvial geomorphologist. I'll explain more later, and I live in Portland, Maine.
I'm Hartwell Carson. I'm the French Broad Riverkeeper in Asheville, North Carolina, and was on the ground for Hurricane Helene and have been here ever since, sort of trying to manage and improve the situation, mostly looking at our rivers.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for being here. And Risa, I think you're gonna go.
Yeah, right. So here's the fellow who and here's a picture of Dave Payne, who's retired Forest Service. He's actually from Fairfax, Virginia, but has spent the last 40 years or so on the Klamath River, and he lives in this happy camp place. And if you looked right behind this or right to the side of this town sign, you would see about a 30-foot statue of Sasquatch. So that's the kind of place he lives in, and sort of explains why he's had difficulty with his connectivity today. However, he shared this. So there's Dave, and we're going to reference this National River Cleanup Week, which was something that he organized in 1997. So Andy, if you could just go to the next slide, it's just one photo. But he shares, or he was going to share his story about, I'm just going to read this if you don't mind. My perspective is from the field, as a field going person who was given a crew and set loose to clean up debris using whatever means we could. So it takes time, and I can't emphasize that enough. Please be patient. These days, it seems no one is patient anymore. You just have to take one day at a time, hour by hour, minute by minute. It took me and my 17-person crew nearly a month to unbolt panels on a giant culvert that had washed out and lodged itself against a bluff in Indian Creek, tributary to the Klamath. It was a 12-foot diameter culvert in fast-moving water. Once we had the panels stockpiled, we had to devise a high lead system to haul them one by one out of the creek canyon, and all of this took time. Recover for an event like this will take years. I was pulling highway guardrails during River Cleanup Week 4 years after our January 1st, 1997 flood event. I checked USGS records and estimated the combined flow of the Klamath River and Indian Creek was at 131,000 CFS just west of Happy Camp. The flood convinced me not to put hardened infrastructure in the floodplain of the river. So our future river access points remained unhardened and natural. Each year they would take on high water and allow the river to reshape them. One hardened handicap access ramp was quickly buried and naturalized by the river because that's where it wanted to go. The Flood Emergency Relief Program, FERP, provided funding for the crew, which came along 6 months after the flood occurred. It provided jobs for locals to help in the flood cleanup and recovery, and I think that crew pulled 12 tons of debris from the Klamath River and Indian Creek in August and September of 1997. We also motivated folks to participate in the National River Cleanup Week for several years after the flood event. In 99, 2 years after the flood, we collected 4 tons of trash from the rivers. 2001, 4 years after the flood, we were still moving the last guardrails from the river. Anything to take away from this is to have patience, ingenuity, and resourceful people who are problem solvers. And disaster relief funding doesn't hurt either. It takes time, lots of time, and the result may never look like what it was before the flood. And I think notably, he was given kind of carte blanche by his management at the U.S. Forest Service based in Happy Camp to do his work. So it wasn't exactly agency work, but they gave him the latitude to be able to collect locals and to, do this great work, which took a long time. So more reflection, but if you'll see some pictures of this year or recent pictures that don't look too different from this. So while flooding is not new, it's becoming more common. So even Dave's experience from 1999 to 2001 is kind of good advice for us. Okay, I guess we can go to the next slide, which might be one of Hartwell's slides. Yeah, why don't you go? I'll just say really quick, because we aren't lucky enough to have Julie with us. Julie works for Rocky Mountain Rafts, and what she was going to, these are not her photos, what she was going to share was that she, as a manufacturer, her community is in the heart of West Virginia Whitewater, the New River and the Gauley River. And I think what she was really impacted by, in a good way, was that the folks who work with her, their friends, their colleagues, all who are raft guides, work for outfitters and so forth, jumped in their trucks, brought what they could, and were down at the hurricane relief site within days, if not hours. So the community really hopped in, and I think Hartwell could speak to that from firsthand knowledge because he is there. But Julie was just going to applaud the folks who rallied without any notice and really helped out as much as they could right from the beginning. Go ahead, Hartwell. These are now your slides. You're muted.
That is not my slide, but I do recognize the sight of a lot of people showing up with a lot of support. That was super key in the early stages. So I work in Asheville. I've been the French Broad River Keeper almost 20 years. And so I've monitored the river a lot. We've done a lot of work to clean up the French Broad River. And so when the flood hit, I was standing on the banks of the Swannanoa River in Biltmore Village and watching houses float by and propane tanks and the river filled with gasoline. And it was devastating to see the impact and the damage to a river that we'd spent so much time cleaning up. But we quickly kind of pivoted to we can sit around and put our head in the sand and be devastated, or we can address the situation, head on. And so we kind of gathered what we could from our staff. We had no communication, we had no power, no water, no cell phones. Most roads were blocked. It was a really difficult situation to kind of assess where the needs were. I went down that evening again to the Swannow River, and I put my canoe in and I was paddling around just to try to figure out where all the oil and gas was coming from. And what I didn't know is that just upstream, maybe 5 miles upstream of the Swannoa, there were people's homes that were completely flooded and people stuck in their attics. There are people that died in a lot of those homes and were swept away in the floodwater. And there was one guy who spent 6 hours of the flood paddling around in his kayak, chopping holes in people's roofs and pulling them out to safety and kayaking them to dry land. And so I thought about that a lot because I was there in my boat, but I didn't know where the need was. It's so one of the challenges of all of these disasters, I think, is there's a lot of people that want to help, and there's a really hard time figuring out how to best help and where that help is most needed. Particularly, I feel like in our disaster, because there was no communication, there was no internet, no cell phone, and so it was really hard to kind of direct those efforts. And so the folks that could get in touch with each other got in touch with each other, and we decided, the quality of the river was important and protecting our river was important. But in the early stages, folks just needed food and water. There was no water. And so we jumped in with some of the community centers, delivering water, unloading water, taking supplies to people that needed. And then we started cooking food for people. We had friends that came to town, very similar to the pictures that you see here, showing up with truckloads of food and supplies and water. And so we got those out to the communities that needed them. We stood in a Rose's parking lot in Burnsville and grilled hamburgers for like 8 hours, one of the, days after the storm. And, this was with my kids in tow. My kid sat in a blanket on the Rose's parking lot for 8 hours. And the one break that he got is we went and played in a sinkhole for like half an hour. So, it's a challenging time, and you have to remember that a lot of folks are struggling in a lot of different ways. But it was really heartwarming. That first instance of getting out there and seeing the flooding was devastating. And then it was quickly really heartwarming to see our community come together, and not just Asheville, but all around the region. Folks of all different walks of life and stripes and backgrounds, coming together to cook food, to deliver supplies, to do search and rescue, to provide water filters. And this was like 3 weeks before the election. This was a time where we're supposed to be bitterly divided. And I didn't hear one person during all of the weeks we were out talk about politics or the things that divide us or how we're different. And it was really uplifting to realize, like, when it comes down to it, people are good people, and they're going to look out for their neighbor regardless of. And if we quit paying attention to the news and the media, we realize, like, we have a lot more in common than we have, a lot more in common than the differences we have. And so that was really nice. Once the cooking of food, once kind of food and water became more readily available, and a lot of that was not from governmental entities. A lot of it was from just groups like the picture you see of Julie's group coming, and just setting up food. We actually got the idea to grill food from these guys that were in the parking lot of the community center, and I thought it was like a City of Asheville run operation. And we quickly realized that all the water that was there was from a nonprofit called Wine to Water, and all the food that was being cooked was from these guys that had just driven down from Ohio. They'd packed their box trailer up. They had chainsaws, food, grill, charcoal, and they were cooking food for like 8 hours a day. And there was a huge line of people. And we thought, all right, well, that's clearly a need. We should do that. And so we started doing that. And then one thing I'm sure folks that have been through a disaster have experienced is the lack of good information. And it seems like in the lack of good information, there's a lot of misinformation. I had friends that come up from other flood areas and said this was a really common problem. We quickly heard all these stories about people's boots were melting off and the toxic mud and all of these issues. that we felt obliged to investigate. And so we started, that was kind of phase 2, was going out and taking mud samples and water samples and trying to provide accurate info to people that needed to know if the mud was dangerous, because they're digging it out from their, their homes and their businesses that had been flooded. Ran those samples, and then we quickly realized that sampling people's wells was a key issue. There were folks that hundreds, if not thousands of people's whose wells were inundated with flood water, and a lot of those wells were contaminated. We found in our sampling about 40 or 50% of the wells were contaminated, and that's with E. coli. And so that was a real need. As folks got power, they could start to, pump their well again, but they didn't have a source of clean water. So that was being done a little bit at the government level, but we found that was still a really big need that we could move into. And so since some of that stuff is sort of calmed down, we're kind of moving into a longer term approach, and we've hired. It was a little uplifting, but also a little discouraging to hear those first stories of, 4 years later, they're still doing these massive cleanups, because we've just started. We're 2 months into this. We've raised enough money that we've hired a full-time cleanup coordinator. We're building out the needs for that, the equipment, and the plan is to have folks on the river 4 or 5 days a week, being led by our cleanup coordinator, volunteers out cleaning up the river. We've gotten a little bit more money where we're hiring 18 raft guides. We're going to put them to work for a month cleaning up the popular whitewater section of the French Broad River. There's a real kind of fear that if we don't do this right and do it soon, that a lot of outfitters will go out of business. We have this window of time until sort of the spring and summer to clean up, and folks aren't going to want to go raft or paddle down a river that has, cars and, plastic piping everywhere. And so there's a real opportunity, and we're pushing really hard to get some bigger pots of money that we could put folks that are out of work. There's, thousands of people that are out of work. Restaurants are slow. Outfitters are super slow or washed away. And so putting those folks to work to do cleanup to prevent long-term economic impacts, I think, will be really key. And we're hoping we can meet that moment. And that's kind of where we are now. And I hope to sit here in maybe a few years and tell you that we were successful. We cleaned up the river. The outfitters are still here, but I think it's still a big question mark on how that'll all look.
Yeah, Hartwell, I didn't realize these were Julie's photos, so maybe we could file through some of the photos and we'll get to yours as well. So these are hers. There's Julie. And she could tell you who they are, but we'll just assume they're folks she works with, outfitters and guides from West Virginia. And now these are yours, huh?
That was in the, sort of during the flood, paddling through the Asheville River District to kind of try to assess the impact of the storm. And that's the next day. So the water's dropped a fair bit. And this actually about a week ago on the Swananoa River. I know the first Dave had said that the cleanup takes time, and people should be patient, but it's also a little frustrating when the cleanup hasn't even started. We're 8+ weeks into the flood, and the Swananoa River looks like it happened yesterday. And so it's getting the government entities, to do their thing, which is frustratingly slow. But hopefully it happens. And that's, in the storm, one thing we're kind of looking at long term is, this is in Biltmore Village in the Swananoa, is how we rebuild. I think that's a pretty important question, and it's still a little early in our process to fully answer that. But, I would argue there's a propane facility just upstream from here, and I probably saw 100 propane tanks floating down the river. I saw a significant amount of oil and gas. This is a gas station located right in Biltmore Village. And so I think it's fair to question what we want in our floodplains when we rebuild.
I think that might be the last photo. Yeah, there we go. Well, thanks, Hartwell. We can take questions when we're done. So if you have any, please hold on. We're all yours, John. All yours, John.
You're muted, John.
Thank you. I'm John Field. I'm a fluvial geomorphologist or river geologist. I study how natural events and human activities impact rivers, their shape, the location and severity of erosion and flooding, and changes to habitat. One adage I often use to help people understand what's going on along rivers is flowing water carries sediment. We're always aware of the water in the river, but sometimes forget about the sediment moving along the river as well. Just a little trickle of snowmelt on across a road is enough to carry sediment, albeit just a little bit of sand and tiny particles. Next slide. But when the big floods come, rivers can carry a whole lot of sediment and a lot bigger sediment. Next slide. And sediment's not being carried during the low flow when I took this photo, but at higher flow, these boulders can move. And not only during these extreme floods is it sediment that's moving. Next slide. We can also see the pavement off roads moving. Next slide. Or the cars on the road moving. Next slide. Or the lumber and bits and pieces of the houses and the trees growing along the river also are moving in these extreme floods. Next slide. So what happens during an extreme flood like we saw on many rivers in North Carolina a couple months ago? First of all, most of the rivers we see are sort of their size is adjusted to smaller floods, sort of the annual flood, if you will. Next slide. So this photo is a typical river in a temperate climate with trees growing alongside it. Next slide. But when the big floods come, in the middle picture here, the river can carry far more sediment, and so it eats away at the bed and the banks of the channel because of all the extra power and sediment carrying capacity. Next slide. And unfortunately, we can see in North Carolina what that means in real life. Before and after satellite image here, you can see the arrows sort of showing the width of the channel before the flood, and then the width of the channel after the flood, sort of taking away the house and road that was alongside the river. Next slide. And just another example from another river. The arrows shifted a little when we transferred the slides, it looks like, but you can still appreciate the widening that occurred and the damage to the bridge and the road alongside the river. So this widening is typical during an extreme flood like this. Next slide. But what happens after the flood? What happens for the decades after without another extreme flood? We go back to these smaller floods that spread out in this now newly widened channel. They can't carry as much sediment, especially when they're spread out across the wide channel. So they start depositing the sediment. The sediment starts infilling the channel, the vegetation grows, and the channel infills. Next slide. So there's two things going on after the big flood. First of all, everybody's in complete panic and um, concerned. What do we do? How do we stop these floods? So we get the big yellow machines, or in this case, orange machines in the rivers doing things to rebuild. And also we have these natural processes occurring, the smaller floods flowing through these over widened channels. Next slide. So here we have the benefit of 50 years of difference, looking at an extreme flood in Vermont in 1973 that widened the Roaring Branch, a tributary to the Battenkill in Arlington, Vermont. The flood widened the channel significantly, and then they had excavators, bulldozers going through the channel. You can still see the tracks in this photo that basically cleaned up the material in the channel. And also you can see a berm, again, the transfer of the slides, but you can see in the distance on the far end of the channel, next, sort of below the bridge there, thank you, a berm that was built, or a levee. They basically bulldozed the gravel out of the river and built up a berm so the water couldn't flood across the floodplain after that. What happens 40 years? The next slide is from that bridge looking downriver, and you can see the 1973 berm highlighted. That was water from the berm across the channel in 1973, but now you can see the channel is infilling with gravel, vegetation regrowing, and the channel is narrowing itself down because we haven't seen a similar extreme flood through this area since. And so everything is narrowing back down. But what is the impact of that berm on the system, blocking the flow and confining it to the channel? Next slide. Right where it says campsite, that section of river between the road and the receiving water, the Battenkill, is where that berming and bulldozing occurred. And that berm is not letting the water spread out. So now it's all funneling right into the Battenkill on the high mountainside across the river there. Next slide. And so all that confinement of flow is jetting the water into that high bank of sediment, and it's causing this erosion problem. So one action on the river is resulting in another response elsewhere. Next slide. So the initial reaction to these extreme floods is for people to say, oh, we got to keep the water out of the floodplain. It caused all this damage. So we see all these berms being built, but that comes at a cost. Next slide. Elsewhere, we might want to stabilize the riverbanks after an extreme flood. That comes at a cost, again, downstream. Next slide. This was basically downstream of that confined area. You're basically increasing flooding downriver by sort of confining and jetting flow through one area. So as we work on sort of recovery after an extreme flood, we need to think about what we're doing carefully, need to think about what the response of one activity might have on another section of river. Next slide. So in terms of habitat restoration, a lot of people are building meanders into rivers because meanders have sort of closely associated pools and riffles, which is great for fish habitat. But if you don't appreciate where you're doing it, you don't understand where the sediment sources are and things like this. Next slide. This is 3 months after that previous slide in the same location. The river straightened itself out completely after that work because they didn't appreciate the amount of sediment upstream still moving its way down through here as a result. So next slide. So I wish I had a silver bullet to tell you that this is what we need to do after an extreme flood on rivers, but it really depends where you are on the river and what river you're on. Every river is different, even different sections of the same river are different. So what you do in one location might be different than what you need to do in another location. And so all I can leave you with is how I started. Flowing water carries sediment, and that sediment is a very critical part of how rivers are shaped and how they respond to these extreme events and the smaller floods for the decades after. Thank you.
So, you know, we've heard from on the personal side, the community side, and then on the river side, what has happened and what can happen. Um, Hopefully, Hartwell, your recovery won't take more than or as long as Dave's taken. I think you have different, you know, set of tools maybe, and the community has gotten together in such a great way, or at least to with a focus on outfitting next year because they're such a big part of the economy. Um, you know, these were really just snapshots of, you know, kind of components of what people are either going through, thinking about, wondering if they should pursue. And then in the case of John's, um, regarding John's expertise, I've heard, I don't know who we were talking to, but somebody said, hey, there's 37 excavators in the river today. You know, there are a lot of people who are trying to do some fixing of something for a specific task, which may or may not be taking into effect with the, you know, long-term, what the river wants to do long-term. So it might be working for today, may not work for the long-term. So those are just little snapshots of from these folks' experience and expertise. And I don't know if we want to hear from those who are listening, or if you always, if you have some questions, you want to just come off mute, or you want to share anything that you think the group would benefit from either if you are if you have been impacted recently in North Carolina or Tennessee, or have other experiences for those who might be looking for just some tips.
Now I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing that so we can see each other.
Evan, you're in the middle of it.
Yeah.
You're you're way in the middle.
Yeah, my head was spinning through I mean, such great presentations. Thanks, everybody. I think Hartwell did a really great job of capturing kind of what it's felt like here on the ground, and his organization has been doing so much cool work. So props to those folks. I was able to volunteer on one of their cleanups that was just really early, and it just felt so good to be doing something meaningful and like see a small change. And I think that's really captured the sentiment of a lot of people is just wanting to help out. So props to Mountain True for kind of capturing that vibe and doing good work with it. You know, John, I have a question for you. I guess, you know, I was probably the one that told Reese at one point, I think there's 300 excavators at least in rivers right now in Western North Carolina. And like so many of them are trying to do good. And they are restoring infrastructure, but I guess my question is just like, do you have any advice on how to bring like knowledge? There's just such a big disconnect between like the knowledge that you hold and the people that are trying to do good with big machines. And it, I feel like the two kind of sentiments I keep thinking about is stuff we're seeing, like we always say, like, well, you could never do that today. You know, like that's stuff that people did 50 years ago, but yet it's being done today. You know, we're dealing with like some things that are clearly beyond the pale that we're pushing back on, like the Nolichucky or the railroads digging up the river. But there's also a lot of just other work that's much smaller scale. It's like, how do we help, how do we be like productive and help people do better on rivers when they're trying to fix them? It's a big question. I don't know. I'm struggling with it.
And I wish I had a good answer. Make a couple points. You referenced it. We sort of go back to what our grandparents did when the last flood roared through, and that's putting the big machines in the river and doing things. And usually, again, as I tried to illustrate, might have negative impacts down the line. How when these extreme floods come, people are coming to me saying, "Oh, wow, you must be busy." But the reality is, it usually takes months until it filters down to me, where the big problems are have resulted. When in fact, perhaps people like me should have been called before the flood to sort of help prevent some of the problems in advance. So this is actually similar to a situation I'm involved in months later after floods in Maine last December. Weather is setting up for similar floods tomorrow. Uh, but um, but one particularly dynamic uh, stream, the river hopped out of the brook because it filled in with sediment and basically dug out the road. That became the river. So the town went in and basically built berms in the channel. And Maine Department of Environmental Protection got word of this, and this happens to be some of the most pristine salmon habitat in Maine, and so DEP has asked the town to basically undo what they did with the berms. And this gets to your point. Everybody is well intentioned. The town was intending to reopen the road. They didn't really understand how these berms were impacting the habitat. So there was a recent roundtable in person at DEP a month or so ago. So I asked the town if I could present there, and I basically asked, "How do we avoid this in the future?" Which was your question. How do we connect these towns to individuals like me that have the expertise? And some they were issued an emergency permit to do the work. I gather maybe North Carolina, there might not even be that step. But with the emergency permit, perhaps it comes with a list of experts. Consult these experts before you begin work, that kind of thing, trying to connect people quicker. I know Jim McCartney's on the call. After Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, we talked about we sort of need on-call experts at the ready to help these towns. I don't know if there's enough experts to get around all the rivers, but that's sort of my idea, is trying to connect these problem areas with the experts, but it's not so easy, and you don't really know you need it until the flood has occurred. So and then it's maybe too late. But so not a good answer, but some thoughts.
John, Raymond, asks about a town that's in, I think, probably a really narrow area. Given a town like Marshall, in a constricted mountain zone, what can they ultimately do to rebuild and be more resilient? Because there's no place to spread out. And that's where there was a big impact in these little, essentially like gullies, small gullies, big gullies.
Right. No, well, what I like to say, sometimes knowledge itself is powerful, even if there's nothing you can do about it. Sort of understanding what the hazards are as you're rebuilding. There's maybe limited space to rebuild, but maybe there's certain things that can be done. Perhaps not confining everything as you're rebuilding, but leaving some areas open to sort of lose some of that energy, which would be protective of everything else. Again, not knowing the specific location or situation, it's hard to answer. Uh, and another thing is keep the memory alive, because again, for the next 50 years, assuming there's not another extreme flood, everything's going to narrow itself down for the most part. And so it's already reached its limits of gouging things out until the next extreme flood. But as everything starts filling in, that urge to develop those slightly habitable lands if we forget about what can happen in the extreme flood, then people are going to end up rebuilding in these hazard zones. So sort of, again, that knowledge is powerful, and keeping that knowledge at the forefront is important.
My coworker Chris Joyelle was in Marshall yesterday, and he's kind of leading our effort around planning for rebuilding. And so he's meeting with the mayor and meeting with the community there. And there's a really strong desire. If you're familiar with the town of Marshall, there's a little dam before the town and a bigger dam after the town. And there was a real desire by the community to remove those dams, which I thought was really interesting. And I don't know, how that would affect the hydrology of the flooding, but there was a sense from the community that did impact the town in a negative way. And so that may be one answer to that. There's the town, there's no way to remove the town of Marshall from the potential to be flooded at a level that this flood hit. And one story that's not really helpful but interesting, there's a climbing gym in Asheville right along the French Broad River, and it was built to flood. It had a flood gate, and it was built to flood to a certain height. Everybody knew it was in the floodplain, and so they spent all this time and extra money. And it was really devastating because the flood was so big and so historic. It was not built to flood to that level. And so the floodwaters went over the flood protections and filled up the climbing gym like a bathtub. And so it's really hard, I think, to think about how to rebuild when we've never seen a flood like this. Nobody would build, I'm friends with the guys that own some A-frames next door to that climbing gym, and they built those A-frames to be 2 feet above the base flood elevation, which was kind of more than they were even directed to do. And some of those cabins flooded 5 feet. So you would have had to build the cabin 7 feet above the base flood elevation, which everyone would have said you're an idiot, and you would have spent a ton of money. So I don't know. It's hard to plan for something that's never happened before. And so I don't really have a good answer, but there are a lot of people that were impacted by the flood because they've lived in their house their whole life, and their dad's lived in that same house his whole life, and no one had ever seen the floodwaters come near the home. And so there wasn't a real concern that the flood would get them, because in the last 100 years, floodwaters had not made it to a point that would impact their home. So that's tough. I don't know. Hopefully that's the high water mark, but it very well might not be.
John, in your experience, have you seen people respond or think about like what Hartwell has been saying as they have rebuilt and done, I don't know, something unusual or seemingly extra crazy in anticipation of the next unimaginable flood? Or do you think it's just more common than people sort of forget?
Well, people tend to forget, but I'd also point out that the things we do after the flood can sometimes make the next flood even worse, like all this berming or leveeing, depending what term you want to use, to try and block the river from getting out on the floodplain. If you don't have any berms or levees, not in these confined areas, but sort of broader valleys, the water spreads out over a broad floodplain. It's a nuisance hazard. But if you're building these berms and the berm breaks or breaches in one location, then all the water's gushing out at one spot, not everywhere. And suddenly you've turned that nuisance hazard for everybody into a life-threatening hazard for the person next to that breached berm or levee. So as you're rebuilding, you really need to consider these implications, and sometimes you can create even worse conditions for the next event.
But then conversely, taking those dams out, Hartwell, might be that would be helpful. Were they dams that were controversial before, like people would never think about taking them out because they were historic or something?
I don't know. I've never heard in my time a lot of talk about removing those dams, or a lot of desire from the community. I think a lot of paddlers have been interested because it would connect the French Broad River, but I'd not heard that from the community. I don't know if Kevin has heard that sentiment or not, but that was voiced apparently very loud and clear post storm. And so we'll be interested to study that to see if that will make a difference in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
It
Great.
would certainly be good in a lot of other ways. You know, connectivity of recreation and aquatic life and
Yeah. Trey, please.
Yes, Trey Moore. I live at the Nolichucky River, and we are currently pretty neck deep in the attempts to rein in the railroad reconstruction. So, John, I wanted to ask you some questions about stuff that's already happened. So it's my understanding that when we start removing a lot of the cobble bars that are within the banks of the river, that we remove impediments that actually slow the velocity of floodwaters down. So in the Nolichucky Gorge, what we're doing in effect is increasing flood capacity, but we're not doing that downstream. And I'm currently talking to town boards and county commissions, and I'm trying to figure out the best ways to illustrate these points of if we increase flood capacity in a river gorge where nobody lives, that higher velocity water is going to have more detrimental effects to the communities downstream. And if we try to dredge the river and make it a flood channel, that dredging requires a lot of upkeep and a lot of maintenance, which can be very expensive in the future. So my question is, the railroad has been directed to kind of repair some of the damage that has been done with native stones, native vegetation, native soils coming from above the ordinary high water mark. Have you seen a scenario where that work has been done, where they kind of like fixed the impacts that they've made and it had a positive effect?
Yes, not only am I involved in that site in Maine I was talking about, but after Tropical Storm Irene in Massachusetts, there was a 5-mile section of river that the town basically built berms and cleaned out the boulders and pushed them off to the side. And they were directed to basically undo what they did, and I helped with that undoing. I was perfectly clear with all the town residents that this was doing nothing to sort of prevent that area from flooding again. It was basically a directive from the state environmental protection agency to restore the habitat that was lost from that work. But I agree, everything you said is correct. Sort of cleaning out that material is going to speed the water up and make the water get downstream quicker and perhaps increase flooding downriver. Again, I don't know the specifics, but that makes sense what you're explaining. And you're reducing what I'd call roughness, all the obstructions by removing those boulders. That's all going to slow the river down, help deposit sediment in that reach. So not only are you increasing the amount of water moving downstream, you're also potentially increasing the amount of sediment moving downriver, which could help fill in a sort of more gentler gradient section of the river and sort of also increase the flooding. So yes, I guess the short answer to your question is yes, I've been involved in similar type projects, and not only can it be used to help improve habitat, but could also be helped to increase the potential impacts downriver.
Is it possible for me to maybe get some materials, like a case study of a river that you've worked on where you've had these attempts to control the river come in, and then the fact that it needs to be undone, just so that I can have like a historical context to give to these towns that are basically facing this in their future?
Probably send you the restoration plan for that Massachusetts example. I
That'd be
don't
excellent.
see
I would love
why
to
I
look it
couldn't.
over.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'll put my email in the chat.
yep, sounds good.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Hey, what's your role? Are you like awesome A+ volunteer? Or
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, so I own and operate a paddle sports, river skills and rescue program called the Eddie Hopper Workshop. I'm an instructor trainer with the ACA,
Oh,
and
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
the vice chair of the river kayaking committee with the ACA. But yeah, I'm just a concerned paddler here in Irwin, and after the hurricane, my house was fine, so I went to Poplar and spent 3 weeks on the ground organizing supply lines, wellness checks, different human resource projects like construction projects, things like that. I led the first search and rescue down the Nolichucky Gorge. I did several search and recovery missions up and down the watershed, bringing closure to people's families, things like that. So just been really hard at work ever since the hurricane hit. And the way that I try to explain it to the town boards and county commissions that I'm speaking to is that's the role of responsible citizenship. Is we should understand that the state and federal government can't be everywhere all the time, and it might take them some time to turn the Titanic to get their efforts pointed at us. And so our job as responsible citizens is to fill those gaps until they can step in. So the first gap that we filled was making sure that our neighbors were clothed, fed, and housed right after the storm. And then the second gap that we filled in was just letting them know, like, hey, we've got questions about these construction activities, and we want to know if they're permitted and if they're permissible and if they're detrimental to the environment. And the Army Corps and the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation have stepped up and agreed that a lot of these activities are unacceptable, and they've issued initial corrective measures as well as starting to talk about compensatory mitigations. And again, I'm just a kayak instructor, and so the fact that I even know these terms and like Section 404 of the Clean Water Act or Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, this is information that's all very new to me. But just trying to be as well informed as possible, because I understand that all of our local leaders didn't sign up for this, right? These are just, school teachers that are our mayors and aldermen. And and their bandwidth is spread really, really thin right now because they're having to deal with so much. So just trying to be a resource for them to say, like, I'm just here to inform you, and I don't have answers. I just have a list of questions that not only am I asking, but it would mean a lot if our local leaders also ask these questions of the contractors and of the regulatory bodies.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for all that work that you're doing. I'm sure those you have worked with appreciate it so much.
We're
Are there
working really
any other
hard.
questions? Oh, yeah, go ahead. Somebody else?
I just said we're working really hard.
Have been pretty clear.
Thanks, Trey.
Other questions, you guys? If not, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand. And if not,
I just have one more thought to echo
yeah,
what
please.
Trey said. It really was like neighbors helping neighbors, and that's what got us through for like a while. Before like official support came but it worked. I mean, there was a lot of really good, really well organized stuff like Trey was talking about that I saw implemented by just regular people that just came out to help. And in a lot of ways it worked, and it worked quicker and better than some of the more official channels. So I think the thing I learned is, like, nobody knows what to do. Nobody knows the right thing to do, but people just went out and did what they could, and it worked for the most part.
Pretty basic, huh? The Electra, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so hi, my name's Electra. I work with the Yurok tribe on the Klamath, and I'm particularly working on a post-fire project right now where there was an intense storm event during the fire, and it created huge debris flows within our creeks that actually dammed the Klamath and created a huge fish kill, as well as there are it's mostly Forest Service property, but there are in holdings, and so there are landowners that were buried in sediment. So from that happened a few years ago, and we've been pushing projects forward since. And I would just say use as many as the emergency permit exemptions as you can to get projects done, because it does free you up a lot to get things done quickly, and it overlooks certain permit needs that might take a long time. I'm working in a California permitting system, so it might be a little different than y'all, but and I was curious, I do a lot of my mitigation stuff is working upslope, so slowing the water down as much as possible from the top of the mountain. By the time you get to the river, you're too late generally, because that's, you know, at the bottom of the slope. So I was just curious. I haven't heard, we use a lot of wood and things like that where I am, to help create roughness in the channel, and I haven't seen any pictures or heard any of y'all say anything like that. Just boulders and berms. So I don't know how much wood y'all use over on the East Coast, but I was just curious about that.
Well, I only had 10 minutes to talk. If I had longer, I would have gotten into using wood, as you indicated, a roughness element. I was already thinking I would forward to Trey along with the report about that project. I was gonna forward to him a link to the large wood manual that the Army Corps put together 8 or 9 years ago.
Yeah.
Which describes a lot of what you're talking about. So I guess this wasn't the venue to talk about it. I certainly hope I'm not giving the indication that building berms and levees is a good idea. I was trying to stress that you can create more problems than you had by doing that. But
Of course, I just noticed in the pictures that there wasn't any wood, and it just wasn't mentioned as far as a roughness channel or using vegetation at all. And I know that's a deeper conversation. I just was curious about that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Electra. Any other questions? Feel free to, but since we're kind of getting to the bottom of the hour, that's awesome. We do have a survey. We thank you for being here. We do have a YouTube channel where we have all of our webinars and river management roundtables, 250 videos, all sorts of types of things that you're welcome to go check out anytime. And then we have, go ahead.
I was gonna say these are just some upcoming events. I'll put a link to the RMS calendar where you can stay up to date. Our next roundtable is going to be in January on the 14th, and then the Southeast, we got a chapter trip in March on the Buffalo River. We've got a wild and scenic river training series coming out. Stay tuned for more information on that. And then Dr. John Field is partnering with RMS to teach a virtual short course, which will be over a few days in late April.
You'll hear a lot about wood in that one.
And really dive into fluvial geomorphology. And then lastly, as Risa mentioned, I'm going to put a survey link here in the chat, and you might also be directed when you leave Zoom, but we'd love to hear your thoughts about this session and any thoughts that you have as we plan out our next year of roundtables and for 2025. So,
well, thank you, John and Hartwell, so much for being here. Good luck with all the stuff that you have ahead of you, Hartwell. And thanks everyone for being here and spending an hour with us. Appreciate you. Happy holidays.
thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.